It didn't come with a warning, it didn't arrive with a speech, and that's exactly what makes it so unsettling, because when power moves quietly, it usually means the decision was already final long before anyone noticed. One moment the official royal record still carried her name, a faint but visible thread tying Montecito back to the crown, and the next moment it was gone, erased with surgical precision, as if it had never belonged there in the first place. No announcement, no explanation, just absence. And in royal language, absence speaks louder than any declaration ever could. Look closer, because this is where the story stops being a simple update and starts feeling like something far more calculated. The royal household website isn't a casual page, it's the monarchy's curated memory, the place where roles are defined, loyalties are implied, and public identity is quietly cemented. So when a name disappears from that space, it isn't an edit, it's a message about who still matters within the institution and who no longer does. And the timing? That's where the tension thickens. Why now? Why silently? Why without the courtesy of even a symbolic acknowledgement? Because silence in this context isn't passive, it's deliberate. It avoids confrontation while still delivering the outcome. It denies the other side a stage, a rebuttal, a moment to respond. It closes the door without ever letting it slam. Inside Montecito, the reaction wasn't just shock, it was something colder, something more personal. Because this wasn't gossip, this wasn't speculation, this was official. A digital confirmation that whatever fragile connection still existed had now been severed at its most visible point. And here's the detail that lingers, the refresh. Again and again, the page reloaded, but the name didn't return. That's the kind of moment that doesn't just inform, it sinks in slowly, like realization catching up with denial. But if this was quiet on the outside, inside the palace, it was anything but accidental. These decisions don't slip through unnoticed. They pass through layers, briefings, reviews, approvals, until they land exactly where they were always meant to land. And that raises the question no one is openly answering: who gave the final approval? Because this wasn't the work of a junior aide adjusting a page. This was institutional. This was sanctioned. This was chosen. And once you start asking that question, the implications widen. Because if the removal reflects current roles as the palace would frame it, then what does that say about the finality of separation? Not temporary distance, not unresolved tension. Finality, a clean line drawn where ambiguity once lived. That's not just administrative, it's strategic. Then there's the emotional contradiction at the heart of it all. Publicly, it looks like order, clarity restored, roles defined, confusion eliminated. But privately, it reads like something else entirely. Rejection, distance, a closing statement delivered without a single spoken word. And that contradiction is what makes this moment so volatile, because it exists in two realities at once: institutional logic and personal fallout. And here's where it becomes impossible to ignore the pattern. This didn't begin with a website update. It didn't even begin with a departure. It built over time through statements, interviews, silence, tension, and that slow, grinding erosion of trust that eventually leaves only one option standing. The removal isn't the cause, it's the result. The final move in a sequence that's been unfolding quietly behind closed doors. But the most unsettling part isn't what's been done, it's what hasn't been said. No clarification, no attempt to soften the impact, no gesture suggesting this could ever be reversed. Because when an institution chooses silence at a moment like this, it's not uncertainty, it's certainty. It's the kind of certainty that doesn't need defending. And yet, even with all that finality, there's still one question hanging in the air, unanswered and impossible to ignore. If the last official thread has now been cut so cleanly, then what happens to everything that still exists outside the official record, the history, the memory, the unresolved conflict? Because removing a name from a page might redefine the present, but it doesn't erase the past. And sometimes that's where the real tension begins. The silence didn't end the story, it deepened it. Because once the official record was rewritten, the real battle shifted into something far less visible and far more dangerous: perception. What the world believes after a moment like this can become more powerful than the decision itself. And suddenly the removal wasn't just a technical adjustment, it was a symbol, a signal, a line in the sand that millions of people could interpret in their own way. And that's where control begins to slip. Because here's the detail that refuses to stay quiet: the palace didn't just remove a name, it removed ambiguity. And ambiguity for years had been the one thing holding everything together. As long as that profile existed, there was always a question lingering: maybe things weren't completely broken, maybe the door wasn't entirely closed, maybe something could still be repaired. That illusion is now gone, and without it, every past moment suddenly looks different, sharper, more final than anyone wanted to admit. And the public reaction? Immediate, predictable, yet somehow still explosive. Headlines didn't ask questions, they delivered conclusions. Words like final, severed, closed forever spread faster than any official clarification ever could. And once those words take hold, they don't just report the story, they become the story. The narrative locks in, and reversing it becomes almost impossible. That's the hidden power of a quiet decision. It leaves a vacuum that the world rushes to fill. But look beneath the surface of those reactions, and something else begins to emerge. Division, because not everyone sees the same message. Some view it as overdue discipline, a necessary step to protect the structure of the monarchy. Others see it as something harsher and unnecessary public distancing that feels less like order and more like exclusion. And when a decision splits perception like that, it doesn't settle conflict, it transforms it. And then there's the part no one can quite measure, the internal fallout. Because while the institution may appear steady from the outside, moments like this leave marks that don't show on official pages. They settle into conversations that never become public, into silences that replace words, into distances that grow without announcement. That's where the real consequences live, not in headlines, but in what happens after the headlines fade. Now consider the strategy behind it all, because this wasn't rushed. It wasn't reactive. It feels timed, calculated, almost inevitable. The kind of decision that only happens after every other option has been weighed and quietly set aside. And that raises a question that lingers longer than the act itself. Was this truly the last step, or just the most visible one? Because institutions like this rarely move once. They move in stages, carefully, deliberately, each step preparing the ground for the next. And if that's true, then this moment might not be the ending it appears to be, it might be the transition. The shift from managing a situation to defining it permanently. Because once something is defined in the official record, it becomes harder to challenge, harder to reverse, harder to rewrite. It settles into place, not as a temporary condition, but as a fixed reality. Yet even with all that structure, all that control, there's still something unresolved hanging beneath it. Because decisions like this don't just close doors, they create new questions. What happens next? Does silence continue, or does it eventually break? Does distance remain stable, or does it deepen further? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, was this about reflecting reality or shaping it? Because that distinction matters. If it reflects reality, then the separation was already complete long before the website changed. But if it shapes reality, then the removal itself becomes the turning point, the moment that forces everything else to align with it. And that means the true impact of this decision hasn't even fully unfolded yet. And that's why, despite how final it looks, this story doesn't feel finished. It feels paused, suspended in that uneasy space where something decisive has happened, but the consequences are still catching up. Because history rarely moves in clean endings, it moves in ripples. And right now, those ripples are just beginning to spread quietly, steadily, into places no one is fully watching yet.